Sam's brain went into overload from the noise of the fight as the attackers and defenders battled around her. A moment later, she hardly heard the sound when Ruth landed with a soft grunt on the ground next to her. Sonny suddenly had a knife in his hand as he threw himself into the fight beside Greg and Bea. The two terrifying attackers were brutally driving the team back into her and Ruth. Sam tried to pull her legs up to curl into a ball, but the movement sent a fresh scream of agony through her. She struggled to see what was happening in the collision of bodies above her as she clutched her ribs in pain. "Stop! Stop! Stop! Make them stop!" She still only saw two large dark figures, featureless in the shadows, but they were lightning fast, and she kept seeing the flash of steel blades. The viciousness of the attack continued to force the security detail back into each other until there was no room to maneuver. Sam couldn't even begin to comprehend how just two dark figures were overwhelming the entire team, but their speed and ruthlessness seemed impossible to defend against. Ruth tried to stand, but was suddenly on the ground again, staring down in astonishment at her abdomen. Ruth put her hands around the black hilt of a dagger just above her navel. Sam was stunned by the appearance of the knife in her friend and could only stare at the blood that began to ooze from between Ruth's fingers. Seconds later, Sam screamed in horror as Cowboy crashed down, landing across her legs. He was struggling to breathe, and she could barely process the fact that the quiet, handsome ranger she had arrived with now had his throat cut and a knife buried in his chest. Sam immediately put her hand around the wound in his neck to try to stem the flow of hot blood coming from it. Greg fell with a muffled thump near her feet, with blood pouring from so many places Sam couldn't even guess how many times he'd been cut or stabbed. Where the hell did all these knives come from? Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Bea grappling with someone in front of Mark's fallen form, until he, too, finally went down. The horror continued to mount as she realized the young captain's face had been sliced open from his temple to his chin. The butchery was almost too much for her to absorb as her friends fell around her. Sonny and Becky were the last two standing. Sam wondered how they had lasted so long against the malicious attackers, but she was completely petrified by the thought that they couldn't possibly last much longer under the onslaught. Sam looked on in helpless disbelief as both Sonny and Becky finally fell from the bloody assault. Still in the shadows, the two featureless attackers laughed with delight as they looked at the mayhem around them. Unable to do anything else, Sam prayed to God for help. One of the men took a step towards her, and Sam's panic almost overwhelmed her. She couldn't believe her ears when she heard a deep, growling roar from the other direction. The advancing attacker stopped mid-stride as his head snapped up to face the noise. A large, fair-haired man in a camouflage uniform leapt in front of the attackers, and she felt, as much as saw, the attackers fall back when the new defender confronted them. The energy-charged air that had caused her initial fear shifted back to something quieter against her skin when they fled down the street. Greg was calling Ruth's name softly as he tried to crawl to her, but Ruth was still staring in shock at the knife buried in her abdomen. He called to her again, and Sam could hear the weakness in his voice. He was leaving a gory swath on the sidewalk as he dragged himself closer to Ruth. Sam saw him struggling and slowing as his strength began to wane. Ruth finally tore her eyes away from her belly and reached out for Greg, falling on her side as she cried out in pain. She reached out for Greg's hand, but Sam watched broken-heartedly as they both lost consciousness before they managed to touch each other.